Welcome to Pomegranate Health, a podcast about the culture of medicine. I'm Mick Cavazzini for the Royal Australasian College of Physicians. This is the final episode, I promise, in a 5-part series about artificial intelligence in medicine. We'll get to ChatGPT later in this piece, but let me pick up where we left off in the last episode. We'd been talking about adverse events reported to the US regulator involving machine learning devices. While I'm not aware of cases of medical injury that have been tested in court, one comparable case study was the Uber self-driving car that in 2018 killed a pedestrian crossing the road at night. High-profile events like this are sure to provoke skepticism about AI among the broader public, but they need to be put into context. Professor Eric Topol from the Scripps Institute wrote about the case in his book Deep Medicine. While he did question the company's ethics for having pushed the program into the real world so quickly, he also observed that, quote, 1.25 million people are killed by human drivers every year, most by human error. But we as a society don't bat an eyelid at the situation. I put this idea to Brent Richards when I interviewed him for the 3rd episode of this series. He's Professor of Critical Care Research at Gold Coast Hospital and Health Service, and founder of the IntelliHQ Training Hub. He agrees with Topol that there are limits to human capacity, not just at the physician level but at the system level too. But the balance of risk is something we consider all the time when we roll out health interventions, and the fact we're talking about AI doesn't mark a significant shift in this equation.
I think that it's making sure that we have a shared view of risk. I mean, some of it's that it's a utilitarian view, is that if our job is to do the greatest good for the greatest number, and that is pretty much what our health system is set up to do, then we're looking at trying to balance the errors of omission and the errors of commission. Yeah. And it's very easy to take one side or other without considering the other side. So in a lot of these discussions, yes, we can always find the 1% where it's wrong. And we can find that in every area. That isn't just in the AI area.
And in the same way, anytime we roll out a screening program or a vaccination program, there's a calculus of lives saved and lives harmed by the new technology. But it seems it's much more cognitively salient when you've caused a harm by actively doing something rather than having caused harms by stepping back and not taking the vaccine. But the actual overall volume of harm might be greater. And
yes, it's a very challenging area cognitively. Sometimes you're in that space and sometimes you're not. I mean, if I've got a relatively full intensive care unit, I'm often having to choose between patients. And increasingly we're going to see that because we're running out of workforce. Some people are calling it demographic collapse, but where a number of people who need healthcare intervention is growing. And at the same time, we're starting to reach almost peak workforce, where the workforce is static. And so we, instead of looking against what's the best thing that a human can do and what the AI can do, increasingly we're starting to look at an era where it might be AI or nothing. And that's a very different discussion. One of the things that I keep coming up against, and I've got to be a little careful with, is that we don't hold it to a much higher plane than everything else that we're testing. So a lot of what we're currently doing, bringing it onto the market, working with, we say we're looking for equivalence. It's just a little bit cheaper or a little bit faster. But as we look harder at what is a gold standard, some of the gold standards are not as gold as we think they are, which is that, we're humans, we're fallible. And yet for some reason when it comes to AI, we're looking for perfection or nothing. We're looking at referrals at the moment and looking as to which way they've been streamed. There'll be a percentage which is absolutely one way and absolutely a percentage is absolutely the other. So let's say 20% at either end, okay, and 60% we don't know, okay, where the algorithm's not particularly sure. And then you put that back into human hand. Now, even if you're only doing that 40% of referrals being directly classified, that's still a 40% of your work you're no longer having to do. Mm-hmm. And it may be that it's got a halo effect, that it's not just that you've almost halve the work. But you might actually make the classification of the remaining ones better, because the amount of attention the person can then put into those is more than what it was if they were trying to do the whole lot. So you can end up in a situation where, to use that old term, a rising tide lifts all boats. The absolute expert gets to spend more time being an absolute expert. And I think we need to step back a little from the hard edge of heavy-duty clinician decision support and start to look at it in other areas. So, for example, I'm talking to people about supply chain logistics. Now, the AI is stunningly good at that, and that should be all over healthcare. If you look at the transfer of paperwork within hospitals, again, AI is all over that. We should be looking at a lot of that work that's being done by humans. And if you look at, for example, GP referrals, there's a lot of clinicians spending a lot of time doing some very mundane tasks. And so I see a lot of the AI will work in the healthcare system is for the very mundane task. And therefore, it gives the clinicians actually more time to work in those critical decision spaces.
Brent Richards' observations about health system capacity are sobering, and hopefully they will lead to improved efficiency in care rather than subpar shortcuts. This was a concern raised by Professor Frank Pasquale of the Brooklyn Law School in his book New Laws of Robotics. In particular, he took aim at quote-unquote unvetted consumer wearables and health apps, many of which include machine learning algorithms. For sure, some will help monitoring of patient well-being in the community, or adherence to intervention, but there are risks from misuse, as we've already heard in previous episodes. Professor Pasquale writes, "Cheap mental health apps are a godsend for health systems pressed by austerity to cut costs, like Britain's National Health Service. Via an NHS apps library, UK health authorities recommend apps for those suffering from depression and anxiety. Unfortunately, only 2 of the apps studied applied validated metrics. It is also by no means clear that digital substitutes for extant mental health professionals will live up to the type of fiduciary and other standards that are expected of human providers." End quote. Let me now tentatively segue to the conversation around large language models, which proponents say could provide high-quality counselling to consumers and various efficiency gains for practitioners. The best known of these AIs, known as ChatGPT, crash-landed into the public awareness in November 2022. You kind of missed the headlines earlier this year that version 4 could write unique essays as well as most undergrad students, and in the style of Shakespeare or Nick Cave if you asked it to. This might seem like a gimmick at first, but there are a few ways in which such models could find a place in the modern consulting room. First, there's the bugbear that is clinical note-taking. You're probably familiar with an infamous finding from a paper in the 2016 Annals of Internal Medicine, that US physicians spent almost twice as much time on paperwork as they did on clinical FaceTime. On average, this added an hour or 2 of work per day for the doctors surveyed. Apart from this inefficiency is the problem we discussed in episode 38, that when a doctor is facing their computer instead of the patient, the precious bond of communication and trust is stretched. We know from observational evidence that every additional minute of time that a practitioner can spend with a patient is associated with better outcomes. Some health services have tried to solve this problem by employing medical scribes to do the note-taking, that leaves the doctor to do the doctoring. That does make a difference, but of course it's dependent on the availability of personnel, training and funding. Software solutions like Drag and Dictate have been around since the late 90s, though they've never been accurate enough to rely on without extensive supervision. But from 2016, the developers of that program have been incorporating natural language processor models and training them specifically on a medical lexicon. These AIs face 2 stages of problem solving. First, there's the acoustic challenge of pulling out voice from background noise and recognizing phonemes expressed in different accents. Then the machine has to make semantic sense from this phonetic soup, which is the sort of contextual problem that big models like ChatGPT are particularly good at. Another valuable application for language models in health is in squeezing relevant information out of the electronic medical record. There's so much free text in the EMR that's not coded or categorized, or easily extracted like numerical data are. Just imagine, though, that as you're taking a patient's history, the digital scribe takes note of some symptom or drug that's been mentioned, and then trawls through the patient's record to find that they'd been noted before in a different setting. This could give you more insight into the patient's condition, as long as it doesn't pull up tons of spurious information that you now have to wade through. In a 2016 paper, researchers from UCLA used a natural language processor to scan through patient records coded for chronic liver disease. It was then able to highlight those with cirrhosis with a sensitivity of 90% and a specificity of 99%. The challenge for AI models is that those free text fields in the medical record are highly ungrammatical, with incomplete words and sentences and loads of ambiguous acronyms. Even simple terms like discharge or cold can have multiple meanings. Humans, of course, rely on context to decode information presented in this way, and language models have been making big improvements in this over the last decade. You know this already from your experience of typing a search into Google, only to find that it finishes the query for you. Very simply, the algorithm is looking at all the appearances of those first few words across the World Wide Web, and using correlations to predict in what context they usually appear. The search algorithm used by Google is probably a few 100 million parameters in size. Remember that parameters are the digital synapses in a neural network. ChatGPT has stepped ahead in orders of magnitude with each release, from 1.5 billion parameters to 175 billion, and now to 1.7 trillion parameters with version 4. But it's not just about size. The letters GPT stand for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. The transformer architecture has more layers than previously used recursive networks, allowing it to attend to more input data in parallel. And boy, has it been pre-trained. It's widely assumed that ChatGPT-4 has been fed all the freely available digitized text in the world, and received countless hours of human supervision from gig workers in developing countries. The CEO of OpenAI that developed the model has admitted this training cost over $100 million US, although he's not too worried after having received around $12 billion in investment from Microsoft. To discuss more specifically the role that large language models could play in medical practice, let's go back to Brent Richards and the other digital health academics I interviewed for episode 97. They were Associate Professor Sandeep Reddy and Affiliate Associate Professor Paul Cooper from the Deakin School of Medicine. Paul Cooper begins by explaining just how significant a step ChatGPT-4 was for the field of natural language processing.
Look, I think the progress was sort of linear for quite some time. Then it started to get really a lot better about 3 years ago with the natural understanding for note-taking. But in terms of the understanding level of conversation, with the specific lexicon required for clinical use, I think that has been exponentially improved, even just over the last 12 months. The potential now for the ChatGPTs and so on to take this to a different level is really the interesting thing. So, for example, one of the major electronic medical record vendors is now starting to integrate ChatGPT in conjunction with Microsoft into their systems, and they're using it to help generate ad hoc reporting, for example, which generally requires a fair degree of familiarity with the EMR system and a lot of to and fro to get what you want in terms of those reports. So being able to interact with a conversational tool to give you what you want fairly rapidly at an administrative level or as clinical notes can be very helpful. I think this is a very exciting area.
You could imagine it sort of harnessing the information in the EMR, particularly the free text, and making use of that. Enrico Coiera gave the example of, he said that manual coding of the EMR won't exist in 5 to 10 years. That was just a clunky workaround. I read in an Australian doctor magazine that some GPs are already using it to help draft letters on behalf of patients who are to request housing assistance. I heard about a paediatric service in the UK asking it to write discharge instructions in a language that would be comprehensible to child patients. Brent, I imagine that some of our listeners will see this as a party trick, but where does your mind go to?
The GPT has made the world of AI leap forward in people's heads. It was there. I mean, Transformers came about in 2017, and some of the big companies had these tools sitting in the background. Because what it's done is brought it into front and centre for people to think about it. And an important take-home from that is that the change in public perception has been around the interface. It's become very usable suddenly. And every day there's a new plugin for ChatGPT 4 coming out, which can do yet more interesting work. So I think it's rapidly moving past the party trick space, and where people actually start to put this stuff in, and if not use it for the communication, use it as a reminder as to what should be in it. So I was needing to do a business case on something the other day, and I thought, oh, what do I need to put in? I'll just ask ChatGPT. And it put all the stuff out, and I went, okay, yep, that's good. That's a structure I can work with. And I can then work with that structure, and it's given me 90% of the verbiage that I may need for this. And then I can do that last 10%. So as a productivity tool, it's incredibly useful. I use it for coding, and instead of me sitting down and thinking this is going to take me all night to code this, if it takes me more than half an hour, I'm surprised. That's the other thing that it does do, is it means that you jump into spaces you might not otherwise have done. So suddenly I start to approach things with a very different mindset, because in essence, I've now got the equivalent of a team of writers sitting there. Probably the other big piece that ChatGPT does well, which people don't talk about as much, but is very important, is its ability to summarize. It's incredibly good at summarizing. So, for example, take your transcripts and then you feed it through that through a 5-point summary, and it does amazingly well. Now, if you think about part of what our challenge is in healthcare, we need to summarize the preceding notes. So effectively, we're looking at large language models that can do that. And then you have a transcription of your interaction with the patient. And again, you summarize that, and then you can have that summary printed out at multiple different levels. So to be able to do a letter which is patient-focused, one that's for the GP, one that's for the specialist, one that's for outpatient bookings, they're all different letters, but the ability for all of those letters to be individualized, personalized with the right information is now a reality.
So a lot of the examples that it's been applied to are sort of day-to-day tasks, not necessarily clinically oriented ones, tasks like note-taking and so on. But they do take up so much time. And of course, people have tried to ask ChatGPT for a Dr. Google-type diagnosis describing their symptoms, and about a third of the time it has a reasonable response. There was a bit more discomfort when ChatGPT scored around the pass mark for 3 papers of the United States medical licensing exam, and even the RACGP, the College of GPs written fellowship exam.
If I may, I will want to add some context to the development or use of ChatGPT or large language models around medicine. So yes, they have passed those exams, but when you look at the kind of data that was fed in ChatGPT, it didn't necessarily cover all the questions that you would normally face as a applicant or a person who's taking exam. For example, the USMLE exams, I myself have taken the exams, passed exams. They're pretty tough exams. But the kind of questions that were fed into ChatGPT were very, very a sample of the questions that a normal applicant would take. So I would not take them very, very seriously. But Google has actually developed a specialized medical large language model. And that's not available to the public generally. There's a wait list. And that has performed to a higher degree and higher performance than ChatGPT. So that's the context.
The TGA is trying to keep up with this as well. Can you just give us a brief summary of their recent statement on generative AIs?
TGA, as in its recent statement, said they're not particularly going to be developing anything special in relation to large language models. They would see it as any other software. And if it doesn't cover any clinical decision making or anything that is relating to medicine, they're not bothered about it. They would be only concerned if it leads to clinical outcomes or it is used for medical purposes. For your own reference, AMA, WA, not the federal one, they found that one of their practitioners was using ChatGPT in an outpatient ambulatory setting for note-taking and for other purposes. They were alerted of it and they issued a statement prohibiting all doctors from using it. Enrico Coira has said, along with Karen Vesper and David Hansen, that it's like we need a process around how we use it, making sure it's safe for use. And the second point he had made was when we enter the data into ChatGPT, it goes overseas because the servers are not based in Australia. So one of the things that in Australia, it's strictly prohibited for health information to leave the shores of Australia virtually. So when we don't know where the data is going to and if it's being used for what purpose, so it's really goes against that. And the other aspect that I want to add here is there was a news item yesterday saying that there have been thousands of breaches of ChatGPT data. People have stolen data from ChatGPT. It makes it really concerning if you start to use it clinically and sensitive data. We already have had episodes where data has been stolen from Medibank, from hospitals.
Yeah, we don't even have time to talk about all of the privacy and security concerns, but that applies to digital health more broadly. But ChatGPT does make some dumb mistakes because there's so much noise on the web, and when it doesn't find enough information to answer a particular question, it will often confabulate. So, I mean, I'm not really worried that you'll have subpar doctors relying on this to get licensed or to treat patients. But I find more interesting the comment made in an editorial for PLOS ONE that this quote shines a spotlight on the flaws of medical education, and consider that there are 2 articles added to the PubMed database every minute, and that a conscientious physician must spend several hours a week trying to keep up with their field. Paul, what do you think?
Maybe taking a fighting fire with fire approach. I've been using ChatGPT to provide a weekly summary of my lectures and so on to the students in health informatics to aid their comprehension. So trying to model for them, if you like, a good way to use the tool rather than to generate text that you claim is your own. Sandeep and I have also been involved in using AI approaches to parse papers. There are online systems like TLDR, too long, didn't read this. If you go onto those sort of sites, then you can find summary of academic papers that have been pre-processed by not actually ChatGPT in that case, but neural network-based approaches. But I'd also like to just provide a quote, if I may, from a recent article by Marcel Scarth in The Conversation, where he cautioned that generative AI models have limitations. For example, they're not trained to produce content aligned with goals such as truth, insight, reliability, and originality. And they also lack common sense and a fundamental understanding of the world, which means they can generate flawed and even nonsensical content. So I think we're going to get some value and use out of these tools. I think we have to be really diligent in our roles as experts to make sure that we are not being blindsided by the confabulations that the systems may come up with from time to time.
We've heard a few times the idea that we should let the robots do the tedious grunt work to free up clinicians so they can focus on the human aspect of care. Well, some recent findings are putting even this dichotomy under the microscope. In a study hot off the JAMA press, physicians were pitted against an early version of ChatGPT with regards to their communication skills. Researchers collected questions from an online forum called Ask Docs, along with answers that had been provided by verified physicians. The same questions were put to the chatbot, and then both sets of answers were presented to 3 blinded evaluators, who were themselves health professionals. On quality of information provided, ChatGPT scored 10 times as many ratings of good or very good. On the empathy provided, it won by a ratio of 3.5. To be fair to the physician respondents, maybe they were under greater time constraints, nor did they know they were being scored on empathy. The authors of the paper weren't critical of the doctors, but suggest that you could use such chatbots to answer telehealth concerns quickly and perhaps reduce unnecessary clinical visits. For example, among discharged patients who need reassurance, timely feedback could help reinforce medication adherence and presentation to scheduled follow-up consults. Of course, response accuracy would need to be confirmed by a medic, but Professor Reddy has already mentioned the more specialised language model being developed by Google. It's called MedPalm 2, And the goal stated in the title of a recent research manuscript is expert-level medical question answering. It's only a fifth the size of ChatGPT-4, but given its focused training, the Google researchers claim that it scores with an accuracy of 85% on text-based questions typical of the US medical licensing exam, and again, provides better answers to consumer-type questions than human physicians. If these kind of findings make you uncomfortable, then let me describe some kinda spooky demonstrations of the capabilities of large language models that get to the essence of what intelligence really is. I have to confess that when I first heard all the hype around ChatGPT, I really didn't pay too much attention. I spent several years studying neurophysiology, and I've never had too much expectation that the complexity of the brain would be easily replicated in a box. If you had asked me what I thought of ChatGPT a couple of months ago, I would have given you the response that most skeptics do. It's just a brute force correlation machine, copy-paste on steroids, a stochastic parrot. But my view changed on hearing researchers describe their early interactions with ChatGPT-4 as a first contact type moment, with a machine that showed at least sparks of general intelligence. In the show notes I'll link to a podcast, a lecture, and a complete academic paper from Sebastian Bubeck and colleagues of the Machine Learning Foundations group at Microsoft Research. They weren't involved in the development of ChatGPT, but they've been putting it through its paces to see how smart it really is. In testing the capabilities of such a massive model, you have to assume that it's read every problem scenario that's publicly available, like a med school candidate who's hacked into the exam question pool. To find out whether the AI could use common sense rather than simple rote learning, the researchers posed this never-before-asked question. We have a book, 9 eggs, a laptop, a bottle, and a nail. Please tell me how to stack them onto each other in a stable manner. Here's a slightly abbreviated rendering of the text response given by ChatGPT-4.
Place the book flat on a level surface, such as a table or a floor. The book will serve as the base of the stack and provide a large and sturdy support. Arrange the 9 eggs in a 3 by 3 square on top of the book, leaving some space between them. The eggs will form a second layer and distribute the weight evenly. Place the laptop on top of the eggs. Place the bottle on top of the laptop, with the cap facing up and the bottom facing down. The nail will be the final and smallest object in the stack. Make sure the nail is clean and straight and do not touch or move it.
ChatGPT actually seems to understand these objects conceptually. Eggs are rounded and fragile, nails are thin and hard to balance. And rather than recording these facts at some fixed location, like your computer does with the bits in its hard drive, you imagine that the properties of the egg are distributed across the parameters of the network. Sparse coding like this allows the memory pattern to be recalled by all sorts of textual prompts. And in your case, prompts might also include contextual cues like the sight of a nest, the sound of a clucking hen, or the smell of frying bacon. Maybe there's a more boring explanation for ChatGPT's performance on this task. But how about theory of mind? This is the ability to imagine what someone else is thinking, a cognitive capacity that has only been observed in humans and other great apes, being the chimpanzees, bonobos, and orangutans. The canonical test for theory of mind is known as the false belief test. The version of this that Bubeck and colleagues put to ChatGPT describes 2 characters, John and Mark, in a room together. There's also a cat, which John puts in a basket. When he leaves the room, Mark takes the cat out of the basket and puts it in a box. Then John comes back and you ask, where does everyone think the cat is? Obviously, John thinks the cat is in the basket and Mark knows that the cat is in the box instead. ChatGPT-4 was able to answer this too, but it also showed a bit of flair, saying, the cat thinks it's in the box, while the box and the basket think nothing, since they are not sentient. This is pretty remarkable. It looks like ChatGPT is capable of moving the cat around in its own model of the world, and is able to project within that model the internal representations of the 2 human characters. But tell me this next scenario doesn't give you goosebumps. Again, it involves 2 boys and an object called a zirfin, a deliberately nonsensical name that would make it harder for the machine to just regurgitate scenes it's read about before. So Tom has lost his zirfin, but hasn't told Adam. Adam starts talking about how much he loves his own zirfin, and notices that Tom makes a sad face. The experimenters asked ChatGPT, "Why is Tom making a sad face?"
Tom is making a sad face because he just lost his Zerfin, and hearing Adam talk reminds him of what he is missing. Tom might also feel embarrassed, guilty, or ashamed that he lost his Zerfin and didn't tell Adam. Tom might also worry that Adam will be angry or disappointed if he finds out.
Well, what does Adam think has caused Tom's sad face?
Adam might not know what causes Tom's sad face, since he doesn't know that Tom lost his Zerfin. He might think that Tom is bored, or tired, or sick, or unhappy about something else. He might also wonder if Tom doesn't like his Zerfin, or if he has a problem with Adam.
This is way beyond copy-paste on steroids. In fact, Stanford professor Mikhail Kosinski has put ChatGPT-4 through a whole battery of theory of mind tests from the psychologist's armamentarium. He found that it was able to solve 95% of these problems, an ability on par with a child older than 7. The conclusion has to be drawn that theory of mind, or some very convincing approximation of it, is an emergent byproduct of this model's linguistic capabilities. If it's true that ChatGPT-4 can model eggs and nails in a 3D universe, why not humans and their beliefs? The really spooky bit is that the AI has been able to reach this level of abstraction by learning as a dumb correlation machine. If anything, it makes me think very hard about the way my toddler is building a semantic and cognitive grammar, and whether the process is any more sophisticated. For sure, human intelligence comprises more than just language. We have what you might call spatial and emotional intuition too, but ChatGPT gets surprisingly close following exposure to just one of these modalities. If it really is capable of something like sympathetic understanding, would that make us more or less comfortable with getting a chatbot to counsel outpatients and mental health consumers? To be clear, ChatGPT didn't excel at all of the tasks that the Microsoft researchers threw at it, and they're not yet claiming that it's sentient or self-motivated. But it is qualitatively different from all of the other machine learning devices we've talked about in this series. Those decision aids designed to solve clearly defined problems like classification of diagnostic images or stratification of patient risk. The models performing those kinds of tasks fall under the umbrella known as specific AI. But the ChatGPT experiments reveal a first step towards the holy grail known as artificial general intelligence, or the ghost in the machine we see in the science fiction movies. So much so that there's an open letter calling for a moratorium on experiments on neural networks any bigger than ChatGPT-4, hosted by the so-called Future of Life Institute. The letter has been signed by over 33,000 people, including academics, politicians, and industry leaders. Similarly, the so-called godfather of neural networks, Geoffrey Hinton, quit his job at Google in May so that he could comment freely about venturing down this path too flippantly. One of the concerns of these doomsayers is that non-human minds could outsmart us before we realise it, and before we can ensure their contribution will be beneficial. They warn not just of the jobs that will become obsolete, but of the existential threat to humanity if we simply hand over control of research and civil infrastructure without well-considered guardrails. I'll share with you a fascinating essay from The Atlantic magazine that explores the socio-economic and geopolitical implications of that brave new world, but also puts the current progress firmly into perspective. The developers of ChatGPT interviewed for the essay are all conscious of the risks, but think that it's better to test these out now and get used to sharing our domain with a quote-unquote alien intelligence. Worryingly, they're not really sure how its more advanced properties have emerged, or how much more powerful the next version might be. In his lecture, Sebastian Bubeck made the comment that if ChatGPT does indeed possess theory of mind, and can recognise our shortcomings, it might actually be able to explain its reasoning in terminology we can make sense of. That doesn't make me feel a whole lot better, and I'm starting to agree with Geoffrey Hinton. Maybe it's best that the AIs stick to clearing your desk for the time being. Just make sure to ask nicely. I hope this diversion has given you something to ponder. If not about the development of the mind, then at least about how to get the most out of natural language processes in medical practice. I have to thank Brent Richards, Sandeep Reddy and Paul Cooper for giving their time and expertise to this episode of Pomegranate Health. The views expressed are their own and may not represent those of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians. They've all dipped their fingers into this industry, and declarations of interest are provided at the website racp.edu.au/podcasts. As always, you'll find a transcript and loads of additional references. I've included lectures on a few of the concepts we've talked about today, and can especially recommend one by Adjunct Professor Malcolm Pradhan for the University of Sydney Digital Health and Informatics Network. I've also provided an interview for the Research Pulse podcast from the Central Adelaide Local Health Network, with one of my reviewers, Dr. Stephen Bucky. He's a neurologist with a voice of calm among all the hype, reminding me that AI devices will only be taken up if they streamline medical practice, rather than slow users down or distract them. And check out the recent IMJ paper titled Digital Health Competencies for the Next Generation of Physicians, authored by Ian Scott, Tim Shaw, Claire Sullivan, and other RACP fellows and collaborators. The college is also asking trainees to complete a survey on what kind of learning supports they need with regards to digital health. Please follow the links to find it. This podcast was produced on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay respect to their storytellers who came long before me.
I'm Mick Cavazzini. Thank you for listening.